So why don't we get started? Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Edith Falk. I'm a member of the board of the International Women's Forum of Chicago. It's my privilege to welcome all of you here this afternoon for what I know will be a fascinating conversation about the Biden administration's views and perspectives and policies relative to foreign policy. So this is one of a series of programs which our forum hosts on a regular basis on a variety of topics, including international affairs, equity and equality, and women's leadership. So if you are interested and are not a member, but please feel free to look at our website, our homepage from time to time and see what some of the upcoming programs are all about. We'd be pleased to welcome you back again. So we are thrilled to have all of you here this afternoon joining us from the Chicago Forum. We have a number of guests with us as well. We have friends from the DC Forum joining in, so welcome to all of you. We also have two IWF Fellows coming to the program this afternoon. The IWF Fellows program is a very competitive, intensive leadership development program. So we're pleased to welcome you to this as well. So before I introduce the moderator of today's event, let me just cover a couple of housekeeping details. We're going to ask all of you to go on mute while Joyce and our guests are speaking this afternoon. We will reserve time at the end of our session for questions and answers. So as we're going through the program, feel free to put your questions in the chat function. We'll keep our eye on that, and we'll actually, we have the ability to go to you live to ask questions when we get to that part of the program. So at that point, if you have a question, I'll call on you. You can unmute yourself and ask the question. So it's my privilege to introduce a member of the Chicago Forum who will be introducing and moderating our program this afternoon. I know many of you know Joyce Winnecke and know of her distinguished career as a journalist. But what you may not know about her is that, and I found this out recently, Joyce actually began her career at the age of 16, writing obituaries and taking sports scores for the Sunday Courier and Press in Evansville, which is her hometown. Got to start somewhere, right, Joyce? Then Joyce went on from there, made her way to Chicago and became the managing editor at the Chicago Sun-Times, moved from there to the Tribune, where she was vice president and associate editor, managing a newsroom of more than 100 people, became president of Tribune Content Agency, and has really had a very distinguished career in journalism. Joyce also has a deep concern for advancing women's empowerment and is involved in our community here in Chicago in a number of ways, most importantly as chair of the board of the YWCA of Metropolitan Chicago. So it's our privilege and pleasure to have Joyce leading our program this afternoon. So Joyce, I'll turn it over to you.
Edith, thank you so very much. That was such a nice introduction, and that it was the absolute best way to start a journalism career was writing obituaries and taking basketball scores. So great days. And thanks everybody for being here and sharing your time with us this afternoon. I'm really excited to be the convener today because this conversation is just so relevant and also timely, but also because it's an opportunity to reconnect with our guest, Evan. Thank you, Evan Osnos. Thank you for being here and welcome.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thanks, Joyce, for the invitation. I'm glad to join you.
It's just really wonderful to see you. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about Evan by way of introduction. He is a journalist specializing in politics and foreign affairs, and he's been a staff writer for The New Yorker since 2008. He lived in China for a number of years, and that time was the basis of important book called The Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth, and Faith in the New China. And for that, he picked up a little National Book Award. That's when I knew I'd try to stay in touch with him. But Evan began his career at the Chicago Tribune. And so that's how I got to know him. We had the opportunity to work together, and he's been based in Washington, D.C. since 2013. His most recent book, Joe Biden, The Life, the Run, and What Matters Now, has received lots of positive attention and been called concise, brilliant, and tragic examination of Joe Biden. I Evan, assume you will win the award for best timing of a book, among others. But I think what's really fascinating to me today, so compelling, is to see this administration begin to take shape and unfold, and to consider the history and the things driving what we see in just 60 days into the Biden administration. But, Evan, I'm really interested in what drew you to this project. What was it about Joe Biden that made you kept going back to the West Wing, I suppose, when that was happening, when there was no real indication he was going to be president of the United States?
Well, thank you, Joyce. I have to tell you, it is sort of, it's not a particularly glamorous acknowledgement about why I got interested in Biden. It was actually because other people weren't all that interested in him. I came back to the U.S., as you said, in 2013. I'd been in China. I'd been overseas for 10 years. I had the great good fortune of working with Joyce at the Tribune. I was a national correspondent, then a foreign correspondent. So I come back to Washington, and I was interested in foreign affairs, and I was trying to figure out who could really give me an insight into it. And people said, you should go talk to Joe Biden, because nobody talks to Joe Biden, because the vice presidency is this sort of maligned office. I mean, he would be the first to tell you, and he did at the time. He was quite clear-eyed about as he put it, this office is nothing unless the president makes it something. And so he was interested in China policy. So that made me kind of begin why I started coming. He was actually meeting back then with Chinese leaders who are now the president of the country and so on. He was also doing Middle East. He was doing what became very important in Russia and Ukraine and so on. I traveled with him to Europe. I'm flying over to Ukraine with him and coming back and so on. And it was always sort of, honestly, I mean, this is sort of embarrassing to admit, but like I was not, the kind of cool kids in Washington were all gravitating to the president and what's happening right around the president. But what I found fascinating about Biden was that he couldn't stop himself from telling you what he actually thought. Like he wears his emotional intensity very close to the surface. And he is, when he talks, he will sort of dart back and forth between and half the things he says, I probably shouldn't say this. And then he tells you, which, by the way, to a reporter.
Yeah, I know. I'm just thinking,
you are so
that's what you want.
Prefaces their statement with that. Yeah. But I found that he was not and this is not hagiographic to say this, but he was not lying to me. And that was remarkably rare, actually. And I'd spent a fair amount of time on the Hill at that point talking to people, and I was just sort of somewhat exhausted by the lean and hungry types who were, and I'm not going to name any names except Marco Rubio, and they were just constantly kind of leading me down these frustrating reporting avenues that I felt like I wasn't getting an honest read. And with Biden, I got something else, and I'll just add one thing and then I'll belt up. But I have to be honest, I was also, I think because I didn't sort of come of age as a reporter within the Washington political scene. I was less interested in the minor mechanics of like who in the National Security Council doesn't like this person and who doesn't have lunch with this person, all that kind of stuff. I didn't care that much about. What I did find sort of amazing was the union of his personal biography, the sheer human drama of his life, and the failures and the tragedies and the moments of improbable success, and the way that those things intersected with his politics. I found that incredibly important and kind of under-described. And so I wanted to, and so that kept me coming back, and the rest is history, I suppose.
Right. And it did turn out to be remarkably on point, and really a useful book at a time, I think, when people just were really hungry to understand more about Joe Biden and his background. And we'll get back to the personal tragedy in a little bit, because it really is the narrative. But one of the things you preview or telegraph in your book is that the Biden administration was intent on moving quickly, go fast, be bold. And I would add that Evan's book was published just like seconds before the election. I don't know, just a week or so, but something like that. So it wasn't clear that Biden would be president, but certainly the administration was making plans. So go fast, be bold. We're 62 days into the Biden administration. How do you assess whether that's what's happening?
Well, I think it was before Election Day, really, and I can sort of say this now. Jake Sullivan, who now, of course, is National Security Advisor, he was telling me that he was the one who said to me that the plan has to be go big, be bold, because, and this is, I think, hugely important, he and many others in this administration bear the scars of 2009, 2010. They were in the administration, and they really believed that if they kind of, through the powers of President Obama's ability to reach across these different chasms in American life, that they would be able to peel off enough of these ad hoc coalitions that they might be able to build some bipartisanship. And of course, that's not what happened. I mean, they had this very frustrating experience, and their view and some of the scar tissue I think that they bear is that they waited too long. They tried too hard. They were banging on a closed door. Meanwhile, Mitch McConnell was making essentially politically productive use out of that failure to get things done. And so they were acutely aware of that. And actually, Biden himself, President Biden, was very alert to the idea that the one area in which he parts a bit with President Obama, they are close in some respects, but they do differ when it comes to what you might call the kind of humid mechanics of politics, getting in there in the room and really selling something. And in some ways, and actually Maureen Dowd wrote a column over the weekend that kind of captured some of this, I thought, quite well, which is that President Obama always felt like he is such a gifted orator that he felt like, look, if I say something in grand terms, that's how I got elected. I don't need to then go and say it 1,000 times. And what you're seeing right now is something very different, which is that President Biden and his administration are going out and now selling people the donkey, which they've already bought. I mean, it's this process of saying it's not enough to just deliver the stimulus bill. We now need to ring the doorbell, show it to people, and say, here's why it matters, and here's how it's improving your life. Here's why it's perhaps a demonstration the government can work again. All of that stuff they really believe is important. And so I think that's why they decided very quickly they were not going to get any Republican support, that the microclimate in Washington is too toxic, still under the thumb of President Trump, and they weren't going to burn time waiting for it. All that's going to do is produce Occupy or Tea Party or whatever. They're going to go. And then, in a sense, they're going to try to use facts on the ground, show people that their lives are a little bit better. Show people they can get vaccines in their arms, they can get checks in their pockets. And that if that works, this is the theory of the case. I'm not defending it. I'm just sort of explaining the rationale. If that works, you can begin to break down some of that, some of the intransigence that you get across the aisle. That's the theory.
Right. So remarkably, it's not just a new president with a new approach versus certainly Trump, but even his colleague Barack Obama, but it's just a completely different world.
Yeah, the funny thing is President Biden told me last summer that he really believed that Republicans would change under a life without Trump. And I think it's early days and it's too soon to say that nothing will change. The chemistry is really live here. I mean, I'm talking to you from Washington, and there are, we don't really know what Trumpism will look like in 6 months or a year. And I think it may turn out that things are not quite as permanently paralyzed as we assume now. But he made the judgment, which I think was the correct judgment, that there was nothing that he could do in the short term to win over. If you can't get, Susan Collins and Mitt Romney and so on, you're not going to get anybody, and you're going to make yourself crazy trying. So what he did was he essentially broke with the Obama theory of governance a bit. And they do see, I mean, I think it's I don't think it's not immaterial to acknowledge the ways that they do see things slightly differently.
Although didn't President Obama acknowledge in his book that he would do some of that differently?
Yeah.
I mean, he acknowledges that approach didn't serve him well in some ways.
Yeah, and I think interestingly, this is where Biden's experience ends up. Look, all of us, our greatest strengths are our liabilities to some degree, and his liability is also the fact, he comes to this obviously with 36 years in the Senate. He believes in the idea of the Senate actually being a deliberative body and that it can do things. That can look to us like a fantasy right now, I think. And yet at the same time, he is pretty learned about the way the system works and how you can, the way they got reconciliation to work here was pretty effective. And they got it, obviously a huge piece of legislation through. It was Ron Klain, who's now chief of staff, who said to me not too long ago that really he takes a lot of inspiration from the LBJ years, because as he says, I mean, this is Klain's comment to me, he says LBJ was not the hippest, wokest guy in the world, but he was able to get the most progressive legislation done since the New Deal because he knew how to work the mechanics of the Congress and because he was able to bring in some Democrats. There's, I don't want to overdraw the comparison, but there's a little bit in common there. Biden would, but there is an LBJ treatment and there's a Biden treatment. We're going to see some of that.
So interestingly, domestically, we have the 1.9 trillion, so hard to remember to say the T, right? $1 trillion American Rescue Plan, and internationally, we've seen a couple of things happen quickly. I think maybe the very day President Biden took office, he rejoined the Paris Accord and rejoined the World Health Organization. I think the timing might be slightly off, but how significant is that really, especially in the eyes of the rest of the world? I mean, so is that also what we've heard President Biden say is America's back, diplomacy is back.
Yeah.
How much of that is really important?
Well,
significant.
In a way, the real worry is that the world has changed and that the perceptions of the United States have changed. I mean, if we're going to be blunt about it, the rest of the world did not sit around and say on the day that Joe Biden was elected, well, oh, great, the United States is back. It's, we now have such confidence in American politics and diplomacy. No, I mean, I think what a lot of the world said, and I know people on this call who are thinking about foreign affairs a lot. Look, the rest of the world said, we've learned a lesson about the fragility of American politics, about the strange pendulum swinging from one to the other, and we can't really be sure what it's going to look like in 4 years. So he comes into it. It's one thing, and I think it was obviously the right thing to announce that the United States is returning even to the concept of agreement, to the spirit of alliance, the idea that these sorts of commitments do matter. But that's the beginning of the process. And what I think is kind of the long-term issue that we have to deal with is we're sort of acculturating the rest of the world to assume that nothing we say or do has anything more than a 4-year shelf life. It's, all right, you may make these bold commitments on addressing climate change, but then somebody else is going to come in who doesn't believe in the science, and all of a sudden and that's a more worrying development, because what that's doing is engineering the obsolescence of American power. Essentially, we're encouraging other places to try to imagine a world without us. And so the bigger task, I think, before the Biden administration is not just rejoining those organizations, but showing that actually we're beginning to deal with the domestic issues that drive that kind of havoc on our politics. And that's one of the things that comes through. I don't think we talk enough about, actually, that there is this real union between his idea of sort of how do you deal with the domestic problems and how do you deal with the global situation? How do you unify those things?
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I was just talking with a woman who's a member of President Biden's Domestic Policy Council last week, and she was saying that very much the domestic and international issues all come together in this era like they haven't before. The threat of domestic terrorism linked to, it's just all very much intertwined. Hey, so what's the headline or what the lead graph on President Biden's diplomacy doctrine? What's he? Where is he? What's he trying to get done?
Well, I think there's a piece of him that is what's a through line that runs through his whole life and applies to his approach to foreign affairs. The thing that really bothers him is abuse of power. This actually goes all the way back to he got into politics right around the time of Watergate. He was kind of, in some ways, marked by the scandal of the abuse of power in the Nixon administration. You follow it through. Curiously enough, he actually, when he talks in private about things like the Violence Against Women Act, one of the things he says is that he regards domestic violence as an abuse of power, and that's one of the things that drives him nuts, is that when somebody, and that goes back to sort of one of the lessons he learned as a kid, which is you are no better than anybody else and you're no worse than anybody else, but do not use your power in that sense, quote unquote, for harm. And I think there is an element that unifies a lot of the pieces, the things he's gotten motivated on over the years. One of the things that most offended him about Donald Trump was that Donald Trump was a walking abuse of power in every way. I mean, just in his sort of personal toxicity, in his approach to governance and so on. And then ultimately, of course, also in his attempts to try to use the United States and use our economic power, our trade power, to try to force concessions from our allies, Canada, European. I mean, it's just, that's not actually how these relationships are supposed to work. And if you extend that also then into what Biden's top line message would be, is he really believes that there can be such a thing as a sincere expression of America's commitment to, and it almost sounds antique and quaint to say it, but a sincere commitment to our values, to the idea of democracy, to the idea of rule of law, that nobody is above the law, that we hold ourselves to those kinds of commitments. The reason why this is challenging is, the single most important relationship we know. So that's one of the reasons why he finds Vladimir Putin to be, from his perspective, almost uniquely intolerable, because he sees Putin much the way he saw Trump, as this walking expression of abuse of power. It's one of the things that drives him crazy about the Chinese Communist Party. And so you're going to see him try to leverage that American idea. And where I think this is risky for him is that in some ways, President Biden's image of the United States is rosier than the rest of the world's image of the United States. And we are, to a lot of the world, we abused our power in 2003 when we went into Iraq. We abused our power in other ways. And we are still trying to recover our credibility. But I do think that that's his, to go to a very meandering, I'm afraid, answer to a direct question. The direct answer would be that his primary motive is to restore American credibility as an agent of the values which we say we hold dear. And that's not a small mission.
So let's talk about you. Let's talk about China. You lived in China for how many years?
I was there for 9 years.
9 years. Obviously, you wrote your last book about China. You said you were just on the phone with someone from the National Security Council talking about China. That's the foreign issue that always looms largest, I suppose. The first encounter in between this administration and China was Thursday. Didn't go so well.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't have that view of it.
No, really? Okay. Well,
in a way. So, for folks who were not watching what happened on Thursday, it's absolutely right. I totally agree, Joyce. It was like tempestuous. It was hostile. They were.
Oh, so you're used to that. I hate that kind of thing. But I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, in a way, it had to happen. This sounds bizarre, but the relationship, the real center of the U.S.-China relationship is at a very low point right now. It is, theatrics can be what they are, but, let's roll the clock back just a couple of years to remind ourselves, Donald Trump had a very schizophrenic policy with China. On the one hand, he wanted to have a personal relationship with Xi Jinping. You remember he invited him to Mar-a-Lago. In some sense, he went to Beijing and Xi Jinping kind of pulled out all the stops and gave him a personal tour. All of that stuff was more or less immaterial, because what was actually happening was that the US and China were proceeding down a track of mutual suspicion that was driven by structural forces. It was not about whether these two guys would have a relationship. It was about this fundamental encounter between these two big powers. And they didn't really have the diplomatic sophistication at the very top to be able to manage that. You now have I've been back and forth to China a number of times over the last few years. And China was, in many ways, was seizing the opportunity presented by Trump's withdrawal from the world. And they used, in Chinese, the term they would use is, this is a period of strategic opportunity for China, because for exactly the reasons you referenced earlier, the US was pulling out of the WHO, WTO. That was just a great blessing for China. Then you have a new administration come in. It scrambles the circuits a little bit. They can't decide whether the US under President Biden is going to be friendly or hostile or tough or weak or one of the usual kind of designations. And the reality is actually that it's not going to be anything like the Trump administration, and it's really not going to be anything like the Obama administration. The times have changed and the tools have changed. They don't really see themselves as fundamentally kind of in a cooperative arrangement. They see this as deeply competitive. I think, Joyce, we have to settle in for the idea that there's going to be a lot more of those kinds of meetings. The one thing I would add, though, is what you were watching, what we were all watching, was a kind of performance. And just like we have our own domestic politics, the Chinese have their own domestic politics, the diplomats who were getting up there, they had a very clear marching order from Beijing, which is go over there. You're being invited to, the chilliest, literally the chilliest conceivable locale.
It was our Secretary of State.
But they were
Anchorage.
in Anchorage. This is like, the Chinese, the symbolism was not subtle here. When you want to show somebody a good time, you bring them to Mar-a-Lago in February. You give them, you make it, it's all warm and fuzzy. That was not this. They were invited to Anchorage in March. And so the Chinese, in effect, had to respond with a recognition that they know that this was not going to be a party. And that's the beginning. Honestly, if that's where they are on the day one, it can only go up from there, I think.
So, well, I know we have at least one person with us who lived in Anchorage for a long time, and I'm sure I've not been there. I'm sure there's lots of great stuff to say about Anchorage. But speaking, the competitive thing reminds me, the competition between the two countries happens in many different ways, in many different challenges. One new way that seems to that has arisen is a competition, if it's fair to phrase it this way, around vaccine diplomacy. So the United States, I think recently in the past few days, committed to giving 4 million doses of vaccine to Canada and Mexico. Not many, relatively speaking. China has already, I believe, given millions and millions of doses to many countries around the world, especially Latin America, and places where they haven't necessarily played that well. So is there anything to that as a circumstance going forward?
Yeah, I think you're onto something important there, which is, the vaccines have become one of the tools of statecraft, which is unfortunate. But we were absent for a while. I mean, we didn't participate in this COVAX coalition of international vaccine coordination and distribution. One of the things the Biden administration did was join that. That was, I mean, again, from China's perspective, when they heard the United States was not going to participate in COVAX, that was just a tremendous gift diplomatically. And we're restoring some of that error at this point and getting involved. But that gets to, I think, Joyce, one of the key themes that is goes to your point earlier about what is the Biden administration trying to do diplomatically over the course of 4 years. It depends what our goal is. If our goal is to try to shore up the position that we occupied for more or less, the first 3 decades after the end of the Cold War, which was the sole superpower, in order to do that, we have to show that we have the strength, the domestic capability to coordinate, to make policy, to get our own house in order, and ultimately that we have the ability to be generous. Because if we can't do those things, then we no longer occupy that position that we once held. And if we don't want to do those things, and more or less, Donald Trump didn't really want to do those things. He thought those things were either boring or weakening. Then we don't really have a claim. And I think honestly, this is a claim to be the great power. I think that's actually what's sort of happening in slow motion here in Washington, is in ways that we don't talk about explicitly. We're kind of going through this process of reckoning with what we really want to be in the world. Do we in fact want to be a provider of public goods? Do we in fact want to be a destination where refugees and immigrants seek to go for safety? Do we want to be the place where the brightest kid from every village in Uttar Pradesh and Hunan province wants to get herself to Silicon Valley? Or do we no longer want that? And I don't think we've actually come up with an answer as a country. I think we're sort of in the agony of trying to answer it.
Okay, so one thing that is quite hilarious is that you frame it as a playing out in slow motion. It's been 62 days.
Yeah.
So, but that goes to, there has been some point of view expressed that domestically, as we said earlier, the administration came in and quickly created a $1.9 trillion rescue plan and got it out the door. And not that they didn't do those, rejoin Paris, rejoin the WHO, those things, but there's some talk or some observation that the administration doesn't seem as bold in in foreign policy as there being in domestic policy, while others are saying, wait a minute, let me look at my calendar. It's only been 62
Right.
days.
You know, I think what's happening is we're all kind of getting used to what a presidency can be that is not driven by the central, that is not sort of wrapped tightly around the central figure. I mean, this is what's interesting is, in some ways, Biden is a more, by choice, he actually really does not want to be the beginning and end of every conversation. And that's unusual for presidents. Either by disposition, you have some presidents who are sort of craving that attention. And then you have others for whom the world sort of thrusts that on them. I mean, if you take President Obama as an interesting example, I mean, one of the things in the memoir that I find fascinating is, you know, when he was given the Nobel Prize 5 minutes after being elected, his reaction privately was, oh my God, like, that's not helpful, because now
Right.
it's now he's desperately trying to sort of live up to all these expectations. And Biden comes in this different position. The expectations are like, you can't see it because we're on Zoom, but the expectations are down here. And that is helpful, actually. And I think there's another interesting piece of this. I was having this exchange with a friend the other day that in some ways, Biden is, I think, advantaged by the fact that, you know, he has done a lot of different things in his life. And there's not quite a sense at this point that he is quite as desperate as other people might be at different points in their political career, to do everything immediately and get all the attention for it. That's not really, I have to tell you, I mean, somebody who sort of, when I pick up the temperature from him, even compared to 6 years ago, I mean, the first time I interviewed him back now 6 years ago, he still had a bit more of that slightly kind of leaning forward, seeking to impress and to please. And he just kind of wanted to like show you that he could be president too. And there's something, and I'm wary of the personal element, of the tragic element of his life, because it can be misused politically. But it's just a fact, Joyce, that he's just been kicked in the face by the fates, you know, by the horrors of life. And I think that he carries with him a kind of tragic awareness that calmed him down and made him realize, you know, what was necessary now.
Well, the last tragedy would have been his son Beau's death, but certainly there have been many over the years, and people have said, and perhaps you said that, the luckiest person in the world, and also the unluckiest, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, it was actually his friend, it was Ted Kaufman, who said that to me at one point a couple of years ago, who said that, you know, if you ask me who the luckiest person I know is, it's Joe Biden. And if you ask me who the unluckiest person I know is, it's Joe Biden. And I actually think if you take those two facts and you put them in juxtaposition, in a way that's sort of it sort of crystallizes the American experience. I mean, we are a blessed country. I mean, blessed, just in sheer bounty. We have natural resources, we have scale, we have immigration. It's constantly infusing us with the, you know, new blood and all kinds of wonderful ideas and perspectives. And at the same time, we are afflicted by, beginning with the original sin of slavery, we are contending with the sort of full pyramid of our own frailties. And I think that there's something about those two things that makes him more aware, more alert as a political person dealing with us right now, when we are as a country sort of reckoning with those strengths and weaknesses in more explicit ways.
One thing that's interesting to me, oh no, I'm going to go another direction here, because I think I don't want to miss this, because I think it might be useful for some people on the call, like what's going on at that State Department, what kind of shape are they in? And I asked that from through the lens of people who do business. A lot of our members do lots of business overseas, and are interested in just where that's going, and what you think about that.
Well, there is a big rebuilding that has to happen at the State Department because it was gutted so much. And I mean, in sheer number of applicants that they were getting on the Foreign Service exam, it was depressed by a dramatic percentage. People just stopped, under the final years of the Trump administration, they didn't really want to go in. But that actually recovers. Like that sort of institutional ballast you can begin to regain, and it takes a while. I mean, there were sort of slightly harrowing predictions of how many years it would take to get us back to full strength. The State Department, I think it'll probably move a little faster than that. It's helpful, frankly, that you now have a secretary who is a product of the department, really believes in it, believes that it can work, that it's noble work, that it's expert work. Under the previous presidency, we had these people who were kind of brought in as change agents at the very top, and they never really understood what the State Department was. And that's not the case now. You take Linda Thomas Greenfield, who's the U.S. ambassador to the UN. I mean, she's an amazing testimony to the power of the department to kind of surface talent. And also, obviously, I mean, to state an obvious point, but she also represents a diverse perspective that you typically don't get at the highest points in diplomacy. I think it's worth mentioning that, LTG, as she's known at the department, is like not just brings an African-American perspective. She's also the first person in her family to graduate, not just from college, but from high school, and to bring that into America's encounter with the world and to say that's who we are, I think is a source of strength. And but no, as a functional matter, we are in the process of rebuilding the musculature of American foreign affairs because it was so degraded. I mean, just to give you one example, there was a period during the Trump administration when there were these big international trade meetings going on. And we, either because for a combination of sort of philosophical objections, we didn't like to participate in meetings, and also we had all these unfilled jobs, the United States just wasn't showing up. And as a result, the Chinese were kind of running the show at a lot of these meetings. We would send one person, that person would leave after a day, and the Chinese would more or less run the table. And so we're kind of getting back in the game. But the theme that you hear, Joyce, domestically and in foreign affairs, with Biden saying, sometimes explicitly, we're back. It's one thing to say it, it's going to take a while to rebuild, right, for people to know we're going to be there.
Right. So where will the president likely turn to really dig deep on alliances, rebuilding allies?
Well, I mean, he feels very close to Germany, actually. He is somebody who believes that the United States relationship with Europe is paramount. And I think it's worth, one of the things I'm not saying is the UK. I mean, the reality is that he has both personal distance from Boris Johnson. He doesn't see him particularly as a natural pairing. I think he's called him something like a physical and moral clone of Donald Trump. Not high praise necessarily. And I think also he comes to, also, as he likes to say, he's Irish. And so that means that he sees he kind of sees Europe more broadly than just the special relationship. So that's going to take a little bit of getting used to in London. However, I will say it's worth pointing out that even though Trump and Boris Johnson were very close, that there was actually a real breakdown at the professional level in terms of diplomacy, that you had the Foreign Office kind of waking up and learning about things that Trump had done overnight from the news. And that's just not going to happen. You have a much more recognizable. Yeah. I mean, it's just this administration believes in process, which can sound dull, except that it's actually process is how you avoid making improvisational mistakes. Mm-hmm. I think you're going to see more time spent with the Europeans. And then one last thing on that, which is their belief is that the way you deal with the China question is by bringing a big chorus of voices together, and that we're much stronger when you bring together the Europeans and what's now known as the Quad, which is Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. The previous administration was trying to have these like independent relationships with everybody rather than sort of build up this, what you could sort of think of as a kind of critical mass of shared weight. And that's actually what we're trying to do now.
Yeah, you may also have made a point at one in your book that regarding Biden and his style, slight pivot, but going back there, the full Biden, as I believe, to borrow your phrase, doesn't play equally well around the world. Is that?
Yeah, well, it's funny because he loves actually the work of diplomacy, and there's one funny moment that I've often thought of. I've seen him use the same line in Ukraine, and he used it in Baghdad. He used it in Beijing, and the line for years was he would see these politicians and he would go up to them and he'd say, "If I had hair like yours, I'd be president." And it's such a kind of somewhat ridiculous, but ultimately winning thing. And they love it. It doesn't matter where you go. Every politician on the other side seems to respond to it. And the reason is that he knows how the political mind works. And his view is that on some basic level, it's the same in Wilmington as it is in, Kabul. And that you have to recognize that they're all dealing with their own domestic political issues, and you have to try to understand where they're coming from. But yeah, when I wrote that the full Biden doesn't play quite as well in some of the more, austere capitals of Europe that it does in, he's a big hit around the Mediterranean because they kind of like some of his, he likes to get in there, and but all things are relative, and you have to remember, the Germans just spent 4 years trying to wrap their mind around Donald Trump, and now they've got somebody who is a much more recognizable figure. So from their perspective, they can't believe their good fortune.
Yeah. Okay. Edith is saying we need to open it up for questions. I see a few in the chat. Edith, do you?
Yeah, so let me just remind you again, if you have a question, put it into chat. We do have a number of questions already, and why don't I call on Elaine Leavenworth, who has some questions about China. Elaine, you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Hi. Let me see if I can get back on screen here.
I can hear you just fine.
Hi.
Elaine had a very distinguished career with Abbott, including lots of time running the entire Washington operation for Abbott.
And the global operation as well, Evan. So I spent a lot of time in China.
Hmm.
So given your remarks about the recent conversations, I did love the fact that they were doing that in Anchorage. It was such a sign of challenges. But if you would talk to me about what you see as the way the Chinese have capitalized on the last 4 years, I've been a little away from this. I've retired, so clearly you've commented on a few of those ways. And obviously we didn't go forward with the trade agreement in Asia, and with all the activity that we haven't pursued in the last 4 years. How do you see us rebuilding that? Especially given this 4-year issue, if people think we're going to walk away, and China's been pushing for the past, 20 years, and really particularly since Xi Jinping took over.
So how do you say? Sorry, go ahead.
I think it's a great question. There's two things that I think are worth mentioning. One is, we were losing ground partly in the public relations game, and then partly in sort of real strategic assets. On the public relations side, every time we sort of closed our borders to people from Muslim countries, or talked about the rest of the world in kind of disparaging terms, all of that was just playing right into China's hands. China got essentially to play the role of the statesman, and that was easy. And then in strategic terms, we were cutting back on foreign aid. We were not pursuing, and this is where that kind of the hidden part of this is really important. Like that trade meeting that I mentioned earlier, where we just simply kind of didn't go. That's laying in all of this legal infrastructure, which is very much on China's terms rather than on our terms. I mean, if you take something like drug development, it matters who is coming up with those trade rules. And, it matters a great deal if we're in the room or not. And we weren't there. But I think to the question of, how do you sort of begin to get that back? And now that people know that we're on this 4-year pendulum, I think that I've been struck that people will actually give us more benefit of the doubt than I sometimes guess. I had a fascinating conversation recently with a European ambassador here in Washington. And I said, honestly, give it to me straight. How are we perceived right now back home in your capital? And she said, you're lucky because you have 60 years of accumulated goodwill that even though you have almost systematically tried to destroy over the last few years, it's going to take more than that. And I took that as it probably shouldn't be comforting, but at least it should mean that we know who we should be in the eyes of the world. And it's about living up to those expectations. I mean, what she meant was we still think of you as the place where the most talented minds and engineers and artists want to go. In the end, they all want to end up in, either New York or Silicon Valley, whatever. And then everything else. Or Anchorage. Some of the best sled dogs in the world want to get to Anchorage. Anyway, you get the point.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I guess it would be helpful to understand if there's things that people can do in business that can help facilitate that now that there's an administration to stand behind it, because I think there's no time to lose for some of these negotiations that take place in the regulatory spheres, because you're right, the future of a lot of industries is really set in those obscure trade and standard setting arenas that have been lost for 4 years.
So let's go to that. If we have time, we're going to get back to that very good question you asked about what people can do specifically, but if we can see if we can work in.
Yeah, Joyce, we had a question from Usha Raj, another member of our forum. Usha, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. So, Biden has proposed the Quad initiative, right? Getting India and Japan and Australia to combat, China's presence. But he's also asked for Modi to make these fundamental changes in how he governs his country, which I see as a big problem. You want a country's help, but then you're telling them how to govern their country. That doesn't make a lot of good political sense. What do you think?
Well, it's a great question because it gets to the core of the challenge for him, not just when it comes to India, but also when it comes to other countries. Because look, what he's saying when he goes to Modi and he says, look, I need you to do these things to live up to India's democratic commitments. We're counting on you as a kind of key player in this, essentially, we call it the Quad, but it's a kind of alliance of democracies. Look, if you're Modi, you could also say, look, I think you have a lot of housekeeping to do on your own side when it comes to democracy. You just had an armed insurrection at Congress, and you've got, large numbers of Americans who don't believe in democracy. So we have, in a sense, I think, before we can make a particularly persuasive case, we do have a lot of housekeeping to do.
Sure.
That's my impression. I think the Biden administration knows that, honestly, but they also, and I think they believe that they are, as I mean, even if they hold Modi's feet to the fire a bit, his has never been he's never probably had more leverage with the United States than he does right now. And so there's a bit of
it's win-win, like you say, it's win-win for India and for Australia and for Japan to join in. So I'm hopeful that they will do something to balance the power, basically.
So speaking of what we need to do and what's going on domestically, Evan, you're reporting live from, where are you?
I'm in Washington today.
What neighborhood?
Adams Morgan, so about a mile north of the White House or so.
Yes, and he was promising that his two little kids might pop in, and they haven't done that, unfortunately. But my real question is, what's it like there today versus 62 days ago?
Well,
Or 70.
I mean, it feels, this is not an exaggeration. This might sound like a little melodramatic, but the truth is, I was here, my wife, Sarah Beth, and I have been here for 8 years now. And so, you know, in effect, it was 4 years of, 3 years of Obama, and then 5 years of, it felt like 5 years of Trump. But it felt really towards the end like a strangely occupied city, because the Trump administration was so at odds with this place. Obviously, it was very suspicious of the federal government, calling it the deep state and so on. It was it's no big mystery. The whole town didn't vote for Trump. Everybody voted, the numbers are clear. It was overwhelmingly for Hillary and then for Biden. So there really was just this constant sense of tension. And then just as a literal matter, I mean, Joyce, it's fascinating. When I moved here, I could jog down to the White House, and I would, you could go right in front of the White House. And I remember thinking to myself, after all these years abroad, I was overseas for 11 years in authoritarian countries, in Egypt, Iraq, China. And one of the noticeable features about the United States was the physical proximity of power. You could get right up to the gate in front of the White House. And there was a metaphor in there that there was just a degree of, the physical transparency and the accessibility. Even if we didn't live up to our ideals, we at least arranged ourselves in such a way. And by the end of 4 years, we now have our seat of government is armored. It is set off from the public. And that's a loss, actually. It's a real loss. Every person who visits Washington and comes to visit, they're now going to see that we are this, it's a fortress city. And that is going to take some undoing. And I think
that's going to take some time.
Yeah. And it really is important. It's more than just, it's more than incidental. It's actually a way that I've had foreign friends say to me for years, I was surprised when I got up in front of the White House, how close I could get. And I think that's something we want to restore.
Right. Hey, speaking of the White House, again, when Joe Biden was vice president to Barack Obama, he was the key diplomat for much of the world. Of course, he came to the position after having been chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and having lots and lots of, and with a president who had limited foreign policy experience. I'm curious, in this administration, how you see Vice President Harris evolving in that role, and what she will do or maybe not do in terms of foreign policy.
Well, it's been interesting so far. She's played more of a role in foreign policy than I think people expected, because she's been in the room in some of these meetings. And I think that speaks to the fact that Biden is pretty adamant about wanting her to be a key piece of this team. And part of that's a reflection of his own experience. He takes pride in his vice presidency. He thought he played an important role. He loves the idea that he was not Nelson Rockefeller, kind of, frustrated sitting in his office cutting ribbons and stuff like that. And he doesn't want her to be that. He actually recognizes that they are much stronger as a duo than they are apart. So I think I'm not sure I would expect her in the long term to play a huge role on foreign affairs. I think some of the reason why that's been the case so far is an outgrowth of COVID, where he's not making his head of state visits. They would never go together to a foreign capital. That's right. Contrary to the whole spirit of the vice. You're supposed to be in separate places. But he's having his meetings from his desk. And so she's there too. And that's vital. I think that's making her office more important. But she plays a really important very important role in this administration that I don't think we have even fully described enough in the press, which is that she's partly expressing what they're trying to do to an audience that is much broader than he can really reach credibly. And also she brings a perspective in. I just think you can't underappreciate how vital that is for them to be able to succeed. He has to know what people are thinking of who are not white men in their 8th decade, because they're going to fail as a presidency if that's how they operate.
Well, on that note, Evan, it is just wonderful to see you. And I really thank you profusely for your time and everyone for joining us. And I think we should all get back together here at what, 124 days.
All right.
So,
That's a deal.
anyway.
Thank you.
So yeah, Joyce,
Okay,
Evan, I
thanks
think
very
we could have
much.
continued this conversation for a long time, but it's been great.
So
Thank you
thank-
both so much. There is a link to Evan's book in the chat, so we encourage all of you to take a look at that. And a question as to whether or not there's going to be a subsequent book on the Vice President, Kamala Harris. So
We
can
shall
we look
see.
forward to that?
Yeah, get busy on that.
I won't be I'm afraid I'm probably not the first in line. Unlike when he was vice president, there are a lot of people who want to go see Kamala Harris. So I'll be lucky if I can get in line, but it would be.
Thank you both again so much. And thank you all for
Thank
joining
you,
us
everyone.
this afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye.